welcome, good morning. Let's kick off. Now, my name is Marco Becht, and I'm the Executive Director of ECGI, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you and also to say some nice things about King's College, which is my pleasure to do. I am a graduate actually of the place across the road, and the only thing I knew about Bush House was that the BBC World Service I listened to in the morning was broadcast from here, but I'd never been inside. And it's my first time in Bush House, and I'm really impressed with Bush House, A. And B, I learned that the plan was to turn this into a hotel, and I think it's much better that it's a part of King's College now. So it's extremely impressive. We, as economists, believe competition is good, and I think the place across the road needs to watch out. I think this is a very serious thing. And it's a great room, and we are extremely grateful for King's College to host us here. And I'm sure that we'll hear about housekeeping rules and so forth in due course. Now, the title of the conference today is Investor Stewardship in an Uncertain World. Now, that is, of course, an extremely good title. I think to state the obvious, one thing is certain, that stewardship has never been as important as today. But the other thing that is certain is that it's become more challenging and difficult than it's ever been. Now, let me just give two examples from this year that I found particularly striking. So the first has got to do with tough choices. And for me, the emblematic example of this was the Moderna vote, or the shareholder proposal at Moderna, brought by Oxfam America and introduced by the Director General of the WHO. You're familiar with this. It was basically asking the board to prepare a report about the feasibility of transferring technology and, in some sense, intellectual property rights to facilitate vaccine production in developing countries. Now, that couldn't have been good for shareholder value at Moderna. It might have been good for the world. 24% of the shareholders supported this. I discussed it off the record with a stewardship professional, and she told me this was one of the most heated discussions she ever had with her portfolio managers. And in fact, they ended voting not supporting that proposal. I think this is just one example of the kind of proposal we're seeing and the tough choices to be made. I think the second thing that is fascinating is who provides legitimacy. I mean, we thought that we knew that it was pretty clear what voting policies should look like. I think today is no longer so clear. And actually, what's the, who gives asset managers the legitimacy to vote in the way they do? And if you open the Financial Times yesterday, there was an 8.1 trillion elephant explaining to at least to the Financial Times. Newspapers do misquote people, so I'm just saying what the Financial Times reported. The person said that they have no mission to, no mission basically, no mandate to get involved in strategy definition of oil and gas companies. Now that's extraordinary, and probably some of their beneficiaries might disagree with that. So these are just two examples, and so again, I think lots of things to discuss. Now, of course, this is all thanks to Dionysia. So also thanks to you for putting this together. And of course to Dan Puchniak, her partner in stewardship. And we'll look forward to the book launch. Now, let me also do a little plug for ECGI. So ECGI is a global network. The motto is leading research with global impact. Dionysia and Dan edit the blog that ECGI puts out. So this is really an aggregator for research that informs on these subjects. And this year we have the motto, or we are launching a new themed project which fits, this conference fits into that, on responsible capitalism, which also is indicative of where this whole debate is going. So this concludes my introduction. So thank you again, Dionysia, for putting us all together in this wonderful room. And I hereby hand over to Alexander Türk to welcome you on behalf of King's College. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm Alex Türk. I'm the interim dean of the law school, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of King's and the Dickson Poon School of Law. This is the second conference, basically, of the Global Shareholder Stewardship Project. 2019 was the first. That was before the pandemic. So it is great to see at least some of you being able to meet in person. Warm welcome to those here, but also warm welcome to those who join online, because I think for some time we'll still have to work in a hybrid format. The Global Shareholder Stewardship Project is intended, please take a seat, to bring together academics around the world and standard setters and practitioners. And if I just basically read out to you the mission statement, which is actually very instructive of what the project tries to achieve. So in ansatz, we will discuss, so to enhance dialogue, dissemination good practice, guide scholarship, shape future stewardship policy through evidence-based recommendations. Now, this is important in the current world of many challenges, and I think this conference is very timely, as basically Marco already said. Now, I would also like to say that you have an exciting day of panels and speakers, and this will also be concluded with a book launch, as Marco already referred to, and I'm quite sure there will be drinks, basically after a very long day, well deserving for you. And I just have basically a few more housekeeping rules, which are slightly more mundane than basically the elevated matters. But before I go through those, I would very much like to thank basically the British Academy. Charles Hamilton is not here, but I would very much like the British Academy and ECGI basically for their support for this event. Thank you very much also to those who organized it from the King's team. This is behind the scenes always quite a lot of work, so I would like to thank those, and for Dionysia obviously for pulling this all together. So thank you very much. Now to the housekeeping rules. Okay, there are fire exits. You need to follow the green exit signs. Okay, so far no surprises. The toilets are located just outside the double doors in the stairwell, and ladies on the left and men at the reception end. There's a busy schedule today, so if all speakers could keep to time and the attendees could return from coffee breaks and lunch without delay so that people who are attending online don't have to wait. I've basically already welcomed the online audience. We very much encourage your participation through the chat function during the Q&A session. We'll take questions from the audience first, and then from online. You'll see this is always the difficulty when you do these things. You need to keep an eye on the chat, and you basically need to read the room. So I'm sure there will be somebody who will monitor the chat, so this goes smoothly. And for the audience members looking to ask a question, please press the button to activate the mic. I have no idea what that means, but probably on the microphone. Very good. So there is a button. Please press and basically lean in. The mics don't pick up the sound unless you are very close. Okay, very good. So thank you very much again for coming. I wish you a wonderful conference, productive, enjoyable. And with that, I hand over to Dionysia. Yes. Yes, here you go. Just in time.
Straight in. So can everyone hear me with the mic or without the mic? What's better? With mic. Fantastic. So yeah, sorry for my slight delay there. I've been asked to talk very briefly, so I won't take up too much of your time, about the British Academy research funding and how we sort of navigated the COVID pandemic, and a little bit about the special research grants COVID-19, which is one of the reasons that we're here, of course. So yeah, just to, for those of you who aren't aware of the work of the British Academy, keep doing that. We are the UK's National Academy for the Humanities and Social Sciences. We do a lot of work, but I personally work in the research funding team. We award around £40 million in funding per year annually, and that is split across both international and domestic schemes from basically across the whole career path of academics. So from our postdoctoral fellowships for people who have just been awarded their PhDs, right up to our senior research fellowships for people with, 30, 40 years of academia behind them. And yeah, so to start, I'd just like to say it's fantastic to see that there's so many people here brought together in part by a British Academy research funding grant. It's really nice for us in the research funding team to sort of, see the end result, the sort of tangible results of what our funding can help achieve. And I'm just going to talk very briefly about the way that the British Academy navigated the sort of COVID-19 pandemic. So firstly, we're quite sort of proud of how we managed to sort of deal with it. We were very flexible in our relationships with our award holders, helping them to sort of continue to achieve their research and dissemination activities despite the COVID-19 setbacks. So primarily what we did was to offer quite a generous level of extensions to existing awards. And we're very proud to say that none of our award rounds were cancelled because of COVID. So in terms of those extensions, they came in two forms, both no-cost extensions, which were put in place to allow, in general, the use of funds for postponed events or postponed travel or postponed research, and also costed extensions. So we were very, very glad that we were able to secure extra funding from BEIS, which is the government department that funds us, and the very kind support of the Libre Trust to allow us to extend multiple awards from 3-month extensions up to full 1-year extensions. So we're really happy we were able to do that. And secondly, we also worked with our award holders to encourage sort of more flexible and innovative ways of being able to carry out their research and dissemination activities despite the setbacks, which again, we're really proud of. And I also want to talk very, very briefly about the COVID-19 special research grants. So this was a grant set up by us in the sort of immediate start of COVID. So COVID became a issue late March, and by May and June, we were already making these COVID-19 special grant awards. The reason we were able to act so quickly is because these are very much based on an existing award scheme we have called the British Academy Leverhulme Small Research Grant. These are £10,000 in value. Up to 24 months they can be held, and they can cover any number of research expenses. So we based it very much on that. We went to BEIS, our government department, and the Wellcome Trust. We were successful in gaining funding to make these awards. The only difference is that these were thematic. So these were looking at the impacts of COVID-19 from a humanities and social sciences perspective. And we were very happy that the government recognized that and they were willing to fund that. And if you just look at the sort of the range of awards that we've made, they are, across the scope of our humanities and social sciences sort of remit. And there's some really interesting stuff in there. So yeah, just to say we were able to make, I think it was 56 awards overall, about £500,000 in funding overall. And then very finally, I just want to say more to do with the British Academy and COVID. We were very happy to be approached by Patrick Vallance and the Government Office for Science, who commissioned us to produce a report into the long-term sort of societal effects of the COVID-19 pandemic from that humanities and social sciences background. We're really happy that the government recognised the good work that we can fund, both from our award holders and our fellowships. And I would encourage you all to sort of go on the British Academy website and look up our COVID-19 decade reports. It's really, really interesting stuff. I've been asked to sort of plug that slightly, so that's my plug out of the way. And yeah, again, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all being here. It's again really great to see people being brought together in part by British Academy Research Funding. I think I'm handing over now to Alexander. Yep, there we go. Oh, okay. Sorry for my lateness. Not sure him. Okay, fantastic.
Thank you, Charles. So just a very short welcome from me too. It's a pleasure of being able to see you like in 3D dimensions after like 2 or 3 years of online only events. I think before we start, some thanks are in order. First of all, a big thank to the Dickson Poon School of Law and the great host, the organizing committee, Halima, for her great work, but also Maddie, who's outside, but also Stephen, Ethan, Louis, and many others. It's really hard to put together such an event within such a short notice. I think we only started like 2 months ago. Also, a great thank to ECGI, and specifically Elaine. She's not here, but she's looking after the interviews at the backstage. Elaine has always a perfect eye for detail, and I thank her for that. And also the British Academy, because a part of this project was actually funded by the British Academy COVID-19 grant, which I got back in 2020, so just after the start of the pandemic. And the aim of the grant was actually to look at how the first year of the pandemic affected institutional investors and stewardship practices. So the idea of the grant was that we were going to collect documents, public documents, like, reports, annual reports, stewardship reports, sustainability reports, media releases, every type of publicly available document from the investors in the UK, and try to understand if they reacted differently in the pandemic in terms of the language that they're using. So this was the idea of the project. Of course, when we applied, we didn't really realize how many documents were going to be out there. So at the end, we had to apply for an extension, which was approved, thank God. So we ended up with, I think, around 1,600 different types of documents, reports, and after pre-processing those documents, Philip Gavin actually is the leader in terms of the research assistants. We had to use like 14 or 15 different research assistants at some point to be able to pre-process all these documents for automated legal analysis. And we ended up with like a sample of something like 6 million words or something, or even more than 6 million words. The plan for today was that we were planning to present some of the results of this research, but I'm afraid this is still work in progress. So we're probably going to organize another conference when we are going to present some of the results. But what we are, I think what we are finding, if I may so, is that there is a much more emphasis on E and S. That's what we see when we study the language of those reports systematically, especially on the S, which I think is one also of the topics of the panels later this afternoon. But yes, so no concrete results yet, but we couldn't really, I mean, without the British Academy, we wouldn't be able even to think about pursuing such a project in such a magnitude. Right, so I think at this stage, we can start with the first panel, and I'm going to invite my dear friends, Dan and Jennifer, to talk about what this conference is about. The title of the conference is Investor Stewardship in an Uncertain World, and we didn't really choose those words by chance. We wanted to talk about uncertainties, and yes, please sit down. I'm probably going to sit too. This is awkward. So the idea was actually the triggering point was COVID-19 and the uncertainties created by COVID-19. But working throughout this project and also working for our book, the Global Shareholder Stewardship book that we're going to launch later today, triggered that idea about uncertainties and different types of uncertainties, including systemic risks, climate change, geopolitical risks, global conflicts, socio-political risks, so all the different types of uncertainties and how stewardship is affected by those uncertainties, but at the same time, how stewardship can improve, can minimize those uncertainties. So it is about this relationship between investor stewardship on the one hand and different types of uncertainties on the other. And I'm talking about different types of risks like short-term risks, medium risks, long-term risks, and what are the interplays between the two. Also, a background of this project is obviously the Global Shareholder Stewardship book that we are launching this afternoon. And what we found in that book is that investor stewardship is much more complex from what we initially thought. When we actually started this project back in 2018, I think. Yeah, I think December 2018, Dan and I were discussing this idea about global shareholder stewardship. And we thought that, oh, it's going to be quite simple to put together a book about global shareholder stewardship, because we thought back then that shareholder stewardship is mainly about shareholder engagement. It is another way to describe shareholder voting, shareholder engagement. So we thought that is like not the new shareholder activism, because it's not about activism, but maybe a new way to describe shareholder engagement and shareholder voting. But what we realized after 3 or 4 years working on the project and many chapters is that stewardship is not about that only. It is about shareholder engagement, it is about shareholder voting, but we are seeing that the markets of stewardship are becoming much more complex. It's not about equity, it's also about fixed income, venture capitals, private equity. It's not about what you do as a shareholder, how you engage. It's also what you do as a portfolio manager, how you integrate stewardship within your investment. It's about better portfolios, how you build a better portfolio, how you integrate ESG within your investment. It is also about how you engage with policymaking, with regulators, with private standard centers. So stewardship is much more complex than what we initially thought. And I think at this stage, I'm going to pass over to Jennifer, who is going to talk a bit more about the drivers of that complexity.
Thank you so much, Dionysia, and thank you, everyone. It's great as an Australian to actually escape Fortress Australia. So it has been, uncertain times and they continue, but it's wonderful to be here. And I must say my university in Melbourne, Monash University, has a special relationship with King's College. So that's particularly wonderful to be here. So Dionysia's comments, I think, are important because she mentions that this wonderful project that she and Dan have been involved in started off with them thinking nothing really too complex here. This is going to be a relatively stable and simple phenomenon to look at, this idea of stewardship throughout the world. However, I think that embedded in her comments, there are at least, 4 areas of complexity that I just want to make a few comments on before I pass to Dan. First of all, the expansion of stewardship actors, the idea that it's not just institutional investors that we're dealing with here. Secondly, the expansion of stewardship targets. Thirdly, stewardship codes and their shift towards a greater focus on ESG matters. And finally, an expansion of, I think, ESG engagement and activism paradigms. And so I'll say just a few words about each of those types of complexity. First of all, the expansion of stewardship actors. In the corporate governance world, there is a particular paradigm which I think has the most traction, and that is the one that comes from the US in relation to ESG matters, where it's viewed that the paradigm is that there will be an activist hedge fund, such as in the ExxonMobil type of activism in 2020, and that activist hedge fund will attract institutional investors to their cause, and then they will be able to push an ESG agenda forward. Always sort of on the assumption that that is going to enhance the long-term value of the company. But of course, outside the US, there aren't that many hedge funds in my part of the world, in the Australasia area. And so what we see there is quite a different capital market structure, a lot of block holders in Asia particularly, but also in Australia, which tends to straddle, I think, both the US model, but also this block holder model. And one of the more interesting developments that is happening on the ground in Australia at the moment, which I only recently became aware of, is that there's a relatively young activist who is a billionaire climate change activist who is seeking to put pressure on Australia's largest power company, AGL, which I think we get our gas from them, to reduce their carbon emissions. And he's trying to do that initially by a takeover and now as a blocking move. So that sort of individual young, tech billionaires who don't necessarily have the same incentives as institutional investors, that's going to be interesting to watch, I think. Secondly, the expansion of stewardship targets and the shift to portfolio-wide and industry-wide targets. Now, of course, this is the spectre that really agitated a lot of anti-common ownership theorists in America. This idea that institutional investors won't actually care how individual companies in their portfolio are performing. They'll be interested in the portfolio-wide performance. So, you know, it's a huge bugbear for those anti-common ownership theorists who say, well, this is contrary to, you know, competition, it's anti-competitive. But of course, it's a source of, you know, it's a virtue from the perspective of a number of stewardship scholars who want to promote sustainability. Now, I think we're going to see a lot more of this systemic stewardship. I think it's already, you know, very common. But, you know, some highly diversified investors, such as the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, they've already indicated that they prefer to engage with companies on an industry-wide basis rather than one-on-one. Now, that said, they also still engage in some divestment, which is, you know, the alternative way that you can deal with these ESG matters. So they've made clear that they're going to divest from fossil fuel companies that aren't prepared to change. And of course, another source of uncertainty in the world at the moment with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, divestment will be a big initiative there, I think, of companies such as BP, Shell and the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund that have said that they will be basically divesting or exiting operations in Russia. Also, sometimes a specific company type, individual company intervention will trigger an industry-wide intervention. And an example of that in Australia was, I think last year, there was an activist initiative by some of the Australian institutional investors, the superannuation or pension funds in Australia, against Rio Tinto, one of the world's largest mining companies, as a result of Rio Tinto's blasting of a 46,000-year-old Aboriginal cultural heritage site. And they destroyed it, and that resulted in what was described as indescribable grief for the traditional owners. Now, although initially those institutional investors targeted just Rio Tinto, by December last year, one of the umbrella organisations for the pension funds, which is called the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors, or ACSI is the acronym, it issued an industry-wide document setting out expectations regarding companies' engagement in the mining industry with Indigenous people. And that's quite relevant, I think, for particularly the US, which has a lot of issues like this. Stewardship and the growing focus on ESG. Well, stewardship codes are really important in this area. And of course, as you will all know, they initially arrived on the scene as a result of the global financial crisis and the Walker Committee in the UK recommending the adoption of these codes. And so the UK has been a great leader in this area of stewardship codes. They've now proliferated around the world. And what we're seeing is a shift from financial risks coming out of the global financial crisis to these ESG type risks that can result in instability and long-term problems. So one thing that I think came out of the book that Dionysia and Dan have edited is the idea that these codes are quite patchy. Even though a lot of them mimicked the UK code initially, there have been changes in relation to ESG, and those changes have been uneven and patchy. And I've been doing a project with a colleague of mine, Dr. Tim Bowley from Monash University. We've been doing a project recently on the interaction of ESG activism on the ground and stewardship codes. And one of the interesting questions we looked at was, are the codes driving the activism? Because there's been an explosion of ESG activism in recent years. We thought that was an interesting question to explore. I don't want to give too much away, but we ultimately came to the conclusion that there's too much too many differences between ESG codes when it comes to ESG stewardship to have them as the actual drivers of the activism on the ground, rather the codes are playing catch up. And so, what's occurring on the ground is occurring from a whole range of other reasons. And then the final source of complexity that I just want to mention is the expansion of ESG engagement and activism paradigms. I mentioned at the beginning that the paradigm that seems dominant in the literature is the US paradigm, that you have, a hedge fund that cares about these ESG matters, and a la ExxonMobil brings along the institutional investors with it as swing voters that management is also trying to lure into its camp. But once we go for a more international focus, we see that that's not the dominant paradigm of institutional investor engagement internationally. And I think there are two different techniques that I think are particularly common in Australia and in Asia that have great attraction. And the first mechanism is collective action by institutional investors under their intermediary bodies, such as that Australian Council of Superannuation Investors that I mentioned earlier, where that will be the driving force for the activism. And that's not something that happens just in Australia. Marco has written with co-authors about a very similar paradigm applying in Japan with the Governance for Owners Japan, or the GOJ. The second alternative, which I find quite fascinating, is what we might think of as a kind of transnational agency capitalism, where local on-the-ground institutional investors who become enraged about something, such as a social matter like the Rio Tinto blasting of the Juukan Gorge Aboriginal caves, they actually reach out to international investors and bring them on board in their activist crusade. And that's exactly what happened in Rio Tinto. The company itself, once this hit the press, it reacted by announcing that it had made $4 million cuts to executive pay. The Australian institutional investors regarded that as totally inadequate for the destruction of a 46,000-year-old Indigenous heritage site. And so they tried to put more pressure on the company, but they had a problem. The Australian institutional investors only owned 20% of the stock in Rio Tinto, and they got nowhere until they reached out, and it was the UK and the European investors that came on board with them. The American investors, much more difficult to attract them. They were apparently enraged that, they'd even cut the salaries of the executives. But in the UK, organisations such as the UK Church of England Pensions Fund joined the campaign, and the Aberdeen Standard Investments, one of the largest holders of Rio Tinto's stock, publicly announced that they thought that the destruction of the site really, put into question Rio Tinto's commitment to, quote, doing what is right and not just doing what is legal. So those are four complexities, and over to Dan.
Thank you so much. Just to start by thanking Dionysia and King's College, it's wonderful to be here. When I was trying to think about what to say to start this out, I was thinking about, the book project and how exactly what Dionysia said about how when stewardship started, it was shockingly simple, right? It was this idea that you needed to get institutional investors to actively engage in corporate governance, and that their business models were naturally set up to do that, right? And so in 2010, although there was huge debate about whether it would work or not, the idea itself and the problem and the potential solution were quite straightforward. And now, as Jennifer and Dionysia have mentioned, it has become a lot more complicated. And I think the complication, of course, comes from this expansion of the E and the S. But what I'm going to suggest, and what I was trying to do in this first session, is not to look back, but to do something very dangerous and to look forward and to try to guess what the future holds. And if you look back for a second, and I'm going to bring a geographic view to this, because my comfortable zone is talking about corporate governance in Asia. And if you look at the first wave of stewardship, the remarkable thing was that when codes spread around the world and you looked at those codes, they were strikingly similar to what existed in the UK. And we'll talk about this at the book launch, but that was shocking because the institutional environment, the corporate governance environment, when you get out of the UK and the US is so different. But you had the same code, right? And maybe this is a caution that I'm going to start out with, which is that, yes, things have gotten more complex, but I'm going to argue they're not complicated enough when you get out of the UK. Because when you go into Asia, you have such a different environment in terms of shareholding structure. Who are your big shareholders? The state, family firms, block shareholders. In the first round of stewardship, Singapore was the only jurisdiction that has a family code. Every other jurisdiction, and including Singapore's first code, didn't acknowledge this very basic and simple fact. And now my fear is with the E and S, we may repeat this mistake. Now, why do I say this? I say this because of a different aspect, and it's this interesting nexus between stewardship and corporate purpose. And of course, corporate purpose, everybody is talking about these days, right? The companies need to have more purpose. They can't just be about making profits. The Friedman Doctrine, right? Colin Mayer's book Prosperity is the big talk, right? In the UK, indeed around the world. You see the newspapers around the world. But what you see with this next generation of stewardship codes, and this is building on the UK 2020 code, and I loved actually Paul Davies' chapter in our book. The title is wonderful and it's repeated several times throughout the book, which is From Saving the Company to Saving the Planet, right? And that is the shift from 2010 to 2020. But when you're in a UK or US environment where you're starting on the shareholder stakeholder continuum, right? And it's a false paradigm to say you're either stakeholder or shareholder. No company in the world doesn't worry about shareholders. No company in the world doesn't have stakeholders, right? So it's a continuum. And what I feel is going to be neglected is that the US is on the far end of the shareholder continuum, the shareholder stakeholder continuum. The UK is a little bit more towards stakeholder, but not much. And then let's look at Asia. I'll just take the top 3 economies very quickly. China, do I need to say more? The Chinese Communist Party. Okay, it's a socialist country. You go and you read the 2002, not 2020, the 2002 Chinese Code of Corporate Governance talks all about purpose. You read the 2018 one, the most recent one, they talk about rural villages. There's no problem with purpose. The question is, are they going to fulfill those purposes? What is the end goal of that purpose? Is Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party going to over-politicize the purpose? If you're already so purposeful, do you need to then have a more shareholder approach to keep you honest for your minority shareholders? There's a different risk of opening up a purposeful approach in a different environment where you push purpose and it can be co-opted. You take Japan as another example. Largest developed economy in Asia, 3rd largest economy in the world. Whoever would say that Japan is about shareholder primacy or the Friedman Doctrine? It's all about lifetime employees. The whole push since the burst of the bubble has been, how do we unlock capital. Indeed, the stewardship codes in Japan were very interesting. They came in to do the opposite of what the UK codes suggested, and this comes from Gen Goto's research in the book. It was all about making the Japanese companies think more short-term, not long-term. Focus more on shareholders, not stakeholders. And now this next wave of purpose, you have a new prime minister in Japan who talks about Sanpo Yoshi, an Edo philosophy, purposeful. What could it be co-opted for, though? Undoing these shareholder amendments in the law to try to push Japan back to the middle of the continuum from stakeholder to shareholder. You take India. India, you go back 100 years. Stakeholderism was before India's independence. You look at the new Indian Company Act, it's all about stakeholderism. India does not have a problem with thinking of other purposes for the company. Execution, though, you talk to my colleague who's a wonderful friend and an amazing scholar, in my mind, the best person on Indian corporate governance in the world, Umakant Veritel. And he'll tell you, it's all about stakeholderism, but the problem is execution. The problem is about protecting minority shareholders from big controlling shareholders. The fear is what? You push a code with E and S and it gives another excuse. India had corporate social responsibility mandate of a few percent years back. The question is that effective? So I start off on a bit of a negative view, which is that if we repeat what was done in the last round, which I don't want to talk about too much because we'll talk about in the book launch, which was really the UK model being taken around the world and co-opted for different purposes, right? And the problem in the last round was occurring not because of the E and the S, but because of the governance, right? It was misusing this idea to turn institutional investors from reticent to actively engaged, and that being co-opted. And my fear is in this round, you may get the E and the S being used for other purposes. And what is the solution to this? The solution is context is everything, right? You have to understand the local jurisdiction, and you have to understand on the ground where you are on that shareholder stakeholder continuum if the push is towards stewardship being one additional arrow in the bow of corporate purpose, which I think is the next phase, right? And why is this important? I am a huge believer that climate change is devastating. Climate change is something that is devastating, but it's also unique. Why is it unique? It is unique because it is not jurisdictional. Pollution does not know boundaries or borders. The whole world has to come together to solve this problem. But the whole world will not do it the same. To have an effective solution, you're going to have diversity in this stewardship approach, not uniformity in the approach. The solution, the result, yes, we want uniformity. The way you get there will be different. And so to just end with sort of a tagline for all of this, it is that prosperity, and now I'm stealing Colin's title, prosperity requires diversity of approaches. And I think that is something that in this next round is very important to understand. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I think that Jennifer rightly described some of the complexities that we have already analyzed in the book, and Dan also looked forward and rightly put stewardship within the corporate purpose debate, because I mean, by definition, responsible capitalism and investor stewardship go hand in hand, and you can't really think one without the other. With all, of course, the jurisdictional complexities that we are going to discuss. So I suppose what we're going to do today, right? So what is the purpose of this conference? Why uncertainties? So the idea is that We take stock of what we have learned over the last 4 years, and we try to understand what is the problem that we're trying to solve with investor stewardship today. Or maybe what are the problems that we try to solve with investor stewardship today? What is investor stewardship? How is it implemented? Is it implemented in the same way all around the world? What are the different stewardship frameworks and how the stewardship frameworks can be adapted to stewardship? What are the solutions and how we can enforce or implement those solutions? And is there one size fits all? And are there different solutions for different type of uncertainties? Climate change is one, but what about a global conflict like Russia and Ukraine? What about voice versus divestment in situations like that? What are the rules when, for instance, you have to exercise your voting rights, but you are also facing international embargoes? So all these type of uncertainties is what we try to debate today. So over to the first panel, and Luca, who are going to examine the different frameworks and how the different frameworks can adapt to uncertain times.